September 28th, 1944, 05:17 a.m., the eastern edge of the Saskatchewan Prairie. The first light crawled over the horizon like a thin blade of copper, cutting through the night fog that still clung to the fields. Sergeant William Bill Mercer stood alone beside the skeletal frame of a burnt-out tractor, the cold metal steaming as the sun touched it. The air smelled of frost, engine oil, and the distant smoke of a workshop that hadn't slept in 3 days. A crow circled above him, its harsh cry tearing across the open silence, as if announcing the beginning of something the world wasn't meant to witness. Mercer pulled his jacket tighter, his breath drifting in white ribbons. He had been a mechanic long before he became a soldier, long before Europe called him to a war that felt impossibly far from this land. But now he was back, not home as a civilian, not free, not rested. He had been sent to this remote workshop because the armored division stationed here had a problem no manual could solve, a problem the Germans mocked endlessly. Canadian farm tools, as they called them, improvised machines barely worthy of the battlefield. He ran his hand across the tractor's cracked hood. The Germans believed this land produced farmers, not fighters. But Mercer had grown up beside this soil, in the endless hum of grain elevators and diesel engines, surrounded by men who could rebuild a broken machine with nothing more than baling wire and stubborn resolve. Out here, innovation wasn't theory, it was survival. The quiet morning broke without warning. A dull thump echoed from the workshop behind him, then another, then a metallic crash. Sparks scattered from the open doorway like fireflies escaping a jar. Mercer rushed inside as the furnace roared and welders shouted over each other. The entire place vibrated with urgency. Steel plates clanged to the rhythm of hammers. Engines coughed and growled like injured animals resisting treatment. The room smelled of metal dust, hot oil, and adrenaline. Corporal Ellis wiped sweat from his forehead and shouted above the noise. "Test run starting, Sarge. We're not ready, but we'll never be ready if we don't try." In the center of the shop sat the reason for the chaos. A heavily modified tank hull, stripped of excess armor and rebuilt with scavenged farm machinery. Its tracks were broader, its drive sprockets reinforced with components from a grain thresher, and its transmission replaced with a hybrid cobbled together from half a dozen incompatible vehicles. The result looked absurd, like a war machine stitched together by a mad inventor, and yet it was their last hope. The problem was simple to describe but impossible to ignore. Canadian tanks posted across muddy European fields were getting bogged down. German forces mocked them relentlessly for their failures, circulating rumors that Canada's armored corps relied on farm toys. The humiliation spread like wildfire. Letters from soldiers carried the bitter sting of embarrassment. Command wanted a fix, something fast, something unconventional. That was why Mercer had been called home. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was the son of a Prairie inventor who had once redesigned half the county's harvest equipment and refused to patent any of it. Mercer had grown up watching machines do what they weren't meant to do, because necessity forced them to. The climax initial came suddenly. The engine roared to life with a violent shudder. The floor trembled as the machine lurched forward, smoke blasting from its improvised exhaust pipes. A wrench fell from a workbench and clanged across the floor. Sparks shot from the left sprocket. Someone cursed, and then the entire tank coughed and bucked like a wild horse, metal groaning under strain. Ellis yelled, "Shut it down, shut it!" But Mercer didn't move. He stepped forward, eyes locked on the shaking machine. The danger was real. A misaligned drive chain could snap and whip through the room like a blade. A pressure buildup could rupture the fuel line. Men had died in quieter shops than this. Still, he approached. He laid one hand on the trembling hull, feeling the violent pulse beneath the steel, listening to the mismatched rhythm of pistons and gears. And in that moment, he knew the tank wasn't failing. It was resisting. Every component had come from a different world, and they were just now learning to speak the same mechanical language. He leaned into the hatch and shouted over the engine, "Hold throttle steady. Don't fight it. Let it climb." The operator nodded, terrified but trusting. Slowly, the engine's violent shaking eased into a deep, uneven growl. The tracks rotated once, twice. The improvised sprockets bit the ground. The machine began to crawl forward almost reluctantly, a newborn creature learning how to walk. The immediate danger passed as quickly as it had erupted, but the exhaustion lingered in the air. When the engine finally died down and the room fell silent, Mercer exhaled and stepped back, his heart still pounding. The fall, the moment of capture, came in the quiet that followed. He realized the machine wasn't ready, Not even close, and he wasn't sure it ever would be. Around him, the men slumped on stools or leaned against walls, rubbing their eyes and blowing the dust off their gloves. These weren't frontline soldiers. They were volunteers, mechanics, blacksmiths, welders, farmhands, borrowed from the prairie towns scattered across this endless land. None of them had seen Europe. None of them had fired a gun at a man. But every one of them had stared down a winter storm that froze the world to glass. And every one of them had coaxed life from machines that should have died decades earlier. The first psychological shock came quietly, in a half-joke from a young welder named Thompson. He kicked at a loose bolt and muttered, "Wonder what the Germans would say if they saw this rust bucket." Probably laughed themselves sick. The others chuckled, tired but amused. But Mercer didn't laugh. For a brief, unsettling second, he imagined a German crew, disciplined, precise, proud, mocking this contraption the way they mocked everything Canadian. He imagined their smirks, their dismissive words, and he felt something strange, something he hadn't expected. Not anger, but a creeping sense of humility, because deep down he knew the Germans were right. On paper, this machine was a disaster, a farm tool disguised as a weapon, yet it had moved, barely, but undeniably, and in that stubborn crawl lay the seed of something no enemy could predict. Mercer stood in the doorway of the workshop as the sun finally broke free of the horizon. The prairie lit up in vast golden streaks, the grass shimmering like ripples on a quiet sea. The cold bit at his cheeks. The wind carried the distant smell of wheat fields turning toward autumn. He realized then that the enemy they were truly fighting wasn't German engineering or mockery or even war itself. It was the land, this unforgiving prairie that demanded everything and gave nothing back until it was earned. The workshop behind him crackled with the cooling sounds of metal. The tank, still warm, sat like a sleeping giant waiting to decide whether it would rise or collapse. Mercer didn't know what the next days would bring, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. If this machine worked, even once, it would be because of this land, these men, and this quiet, relentless determination that no enemy had ever taken seriously. By late afternoon, the wind had sharpened, dragging long fingers of cold across the prairie as if reminding the men in the workshop that autumn here was only a polite prelude to the kind of winter that crushed spirits. Sergeant Bill Mercer stepped outside for a moment of silence, letting the vastness of the land swallow the mechanical clamor behind him. The sky was widening into iron-gray plates, stacking over the horizon like the armor of some ancient leviathan. Somewhere far off, a grain elevator groaned under the wind, its timbers creaking like the joints of an old soldier. He lit a cigarette with hands that still trembled slightly from the earlier engine test. The smoke curled upward, caught instantly by the wind and pulled apart. For a moment he watched it vanish, as if the prairie itself refused to hold anything fragile. And then he heard it, not loud, not distinct, but unmistakable, the approach of trucks. Moments later, 2 military transports rolled into the yard, tires kicking up dust over gravel. A captain stepped down, his greatcoat snapping with each gust. His name was Robert Hall, a liaison officer from Ottawa, the kind of man whose boots were polished too often to be trusted by mechanics. His expression was stern, clinical, as if assessing not the project but the worth of the men who stood around it. Hall gave a cold nod. Command wants progress, not theories. His eyes traveled across the patched-together machine behind Mercer. "I need results, Sergeant. Tanks overseas are drowning in mud. If this prototype fails, your entire unit will be reassigned." Reassigned. The word hung in the air like frost. Mercer swallowed hard. These men weren't soldiers by nature. They were volunteers holding the line between hope and humiliation. Reassignment meant cities, paperwork, irrelevance. The Prairie workshop, this strange mix of noise, sweat, and impossible goals, had become their battleground. Being torn from it would feel like defeat. He nodded calmly. "We'll have results." Hall left without another word, but the ground seemed colder when the trucks disappeared down the road. Inside, the workshop hummed with a tension Mercer hadn't heard before. The men worked faster, more aggressively, as if the threat of being scattered across unknown postings fueled their determination. Sparks whipped across the floor in orange arcs. Chains rattled. Grease hissed over hot metal. The air stank of molten steel and desperation. It was during this chaos that the first true fracture appeared, not in the machine, but in the men. Thompson, the young welder with too much fire in his blood, dropped his torch and kicked a toolbox so hard it skidded into a workbench. "We can't weld through this plate, it's garbage." Everything's garbage. They're mocking us before we even start. Corporal Ellis slammed a fist on the table. We don't have time for tantrums. No, Thompson shot back, breath sharp. We don't have time because they treat us like farmhands playing soldier. Germans are laughing at us, command is threatening us, and we're stuck building this. A heavy silence fell. The machine loomed in the center of the room, half assembled, half mutated, a creature stitched together from desperation and prairie instinct. Under harsh industrial lamps, its mismatched components seemed more grotesque than heroic. Mercer stepped between the men, placing a hand on Thompson's shoulder. They can laugh, he said quietly. They can underestimate us. Let them. Because when this thing moves right, when it crosses the mud like nothing else, they'll remember what we did here. Thompson looked away, jaw tight, but he didn't argue again. He picked up his torch and returned to work, though his movements were slower, more uncertain. Night fell quickly on the prairie. Without the sun, the temperature dropped sharply and the cold seeped into the workshop through every crack in the wooden walls. Breath turned visible. Tools stung when touched. The furnace belched warm air, but it fought a losing battle against the relentless chill. Yet this was the moment Mercer knew the men would either break or transform. He assigned small teams to tasks that seemed almost ritualistic, adjusting tension on track links, calibrating sprocket teeth, smoothing weld lines until they gleamed like chrome. Ellis hunched over the fuel injection system, muttering to himself as if coaxing a shy animal from hiding. Thompson welded with renewed precision, sparks painting his determined face in bursts of fleeting light. Even the oldest mechanic, Harris, a man whose knuckles were as scarred as the prairie winds, crawled beneath the tank with a wrench bigger than his forearm, grumbling but working. Hours passed. The night thickened. Then came the moment when the emotional center of the story shifted. Mercer stepped outside again, perhaps seeking fresh air or a moment's clarity, but what he found was neither. Instead, he saw a solitary figure approaching the workshop from the darkness, an elderly farmer with a wool coat, carrying a wooden crate. Behind him, 2 teenage boys followed, also burdened with crates. All 3 walked with the slow, purposeful rhythm of men who understood machines the way others understood prayers. The old man stopped in front of Mercer. His beard was stiff with frost. His breath came in white puffs. He spoke so softly the wind nearly swallowed his words. Heard you were building something that needs to move through hell. Mercer blinked. Who told you that? Everybody, the man said simply. Word travels. He handed Mercer the crate. Inside were handmade components. Gears, bearings, custom-shaped iron plates, and what looked like parts from a cedar drill, polished until they shone like brand new steel. These'll bite into mud better than anything your army hands out, the farmer said. Prairie tools. Built for storms and stubborn land. Thought you might need them. Mercer was speechless. As if sensing his hesitation, the old man added, My boy's in Normandy. He wrote home saying tanks keep drowning. If we can help fix that, we're damned well going to try. The psychological shock struck deeper than anything Hall's threats had stirred. Mercer felt the weight of the crates not in his hands but in his chest. For the first time, he understood that what they were building wasn't simply a prototype. It was a collective defiance. A prairie instinct passed from father to son, from workshop to battlefield. He thanked the man, voice tight, and carried the crates inside. When the volunteers saw what lay within, their fatigue evaporated. Ellis ran hands over the custom bearings with a reverence normally reserved for relics. Thompson stared at the oddly shaped iron plates as if they were holy artifacts. No one mocked the idea of farm tools now. Instead, they saw something else entirely. Craftsmanship born of necessity. Intelligence shaped by hardship. The workshop transformed after that. It no longer felt like a military station but a communal forge, a place where the land itself seemed to whisper through gears and steel. For the next several hours, men worked with a unified rhythm. The machine began to feel less like a patchwork experiment and more like a creature adapting to its environment. The cedar plates fit the sprocket housings as if purposefully designed for them. The bearings allowed the tracks to glide with unexpected smoothness. Even the hybrid transmission responded with cleaner, more confident sounds. Outside, the prairie wind howled like a distant wolf, slamming against the building. But inside, the tank was beginning to breathe. By dawn, a strange calm settled over the workshop. Tools rested in neat lines. The furnace burned low. The machine, born from improvisation, frustration, and quiet brilliance, sat in perfect stillness, almost regal in its mismatched form. Mercer approached it with slow steps, touching the cold steel with a gentleness that bordered on reverence. He felt its weight, its defiance, its promise, and in that moment he sensed something shift within himself. They hadn't built a weapon. They had built a Prairie answer to a European war, and soon, the Germans who mocked Canada's farm tools would see exactly what that meant. The next morning broke with a brittle, glass-like clarity. The Prairie was frozen under a thin sheet of hoarfrost that shimmered in pale gold as the sun crawled above the horizon. Every blade of grass seemed carved from ice. Every movement felt slower, heavier, as if the land itself were testing the resolve of anyone daring to cross it. Sergeant Bill Mercer stood in the doorway of the workshop, watching his breath drift away in long, white ribbons. Behind him, the men stirred quietly, gathering tools, tightening gloves, checking straps on their coats. No one spoke of fear or doubt. They didn't need to. The silence itself held all the weight of those emotions, pressed flat and hard by determination. Today would be the first true trial. They had tested the engine indoors. They had crawled under the machine 100 times. They had welded and re-welded every joint until sparks seemed to pour from their very dreams. But nothing mattered until the machine faced the Prairie outside, the land whose mud and frost mirrored the battlegrounds of Europe in ways no general in Ottawa had ever fully understood. Ellis approached, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. "She's as ready as she'll ever be," he muttered. "If she breaks out there." Mercer nodded. "Then out there it is." They pushed the workshop doors open. Cold air rushed in like a living force, biting their cheeks, stiffening their fingers. The tank, still nameless, still awkwardly assembled but now undeniably alive, sat waiting, tracks dusted with frost, steel plates catching faint glimmers of morning light. The operator climbed in. The engine coughed twice, then roared, deeper and cleaner than the day before. The entire hull vibrated, but not violently. It was a steady, confident tremor, like a heart finding its rhythm. The men exchanged cautious, almost superstitious glances. "Take her forward," Mercer ordered. The tracks engaged. Metal crushed frost. The machine lurched, then steadied, moving across the yard with slow, deliberate weight. The crunching sound echoed in the open field. It wasn't smooth, not yet, but it was a movement that carried intention. Thompson whispered, "Holy hell, it's actually working." But the true test wasn't the yard. It was the field beyond. A stretch of deep, uneven soil packed with last week's rain and last night's freeze. The kind of ground that swallowed military vehicles whole. The kind of ground that had turned Canadian tank crews into jokes among German officers. Mercer walked beside the tank as it approached the field, boots sinking slightly into the thawing soil. The air smelled of wet earth, cold metal, and the faint sweetness of grain carried by the wind from distant silos. The operator hesitated at the field's edge. "Do it," Mercer said quietly. The tank nosed forward. Its tracks hit the mud with a heavy squelch, and instead of sinking, they bit. The improvised cedar plates rotated, clawing into the softened earth with a grip Mercer had only hoped for, never truly believed possible. The machine surged forward, scattering chunks of soil behind it, its weight distributed evenly across the broad hybrid tracks. Each rotation looked like defiance, each meter gained like a small miracle. Inside the workshop doorway, the volunteers watched in stunned silence. Ellis exhaled in a shaky whisper. "It's floating on mud. It's actually floating." The tank kept going. 10 meters, 20, 50. The engine groaned but didn't falter. The tracks churned steadily, chewing through mud that would have imprisoned a Sherman tank in seconds. Mercer felt something tighten in his throat. Pride, relief, disbelief, all woven into one fragile, overwhelming sensation. "This," Thompson said behind him, voice cracking, "this is going to make them choke on their jokes." But then came the shift in tempo, the start of the descent, the quiet fall before the psychological turn. At the far edge of the field, the tank hesitated. Its left track hit a patch of deep muck, darker than the rest, where underground water seeped to the surface. The machine dipped. Mud climbed halfway up the track. The engine strained. The operator shouted inside. For a heartbeat, fear returned. The men tensed. Failure felt as cold as the wind. Mercer ran forward, boots sinking. He placed one hand on the hull as if physical touch could transmit steady resolve. He leaned close to the engine's vibration, listening for the stutter of a failing gear. But instead, he heard something else. The strained but consistent rhythm of components working harder than they ever had. "Throttle steady," Mercer shouted. "Don't gun it. Let the tracks climb." The operator followed the command. Slowly, painfully slowly, The improvised cedar plates bit into the mud, angled just enough to pull the tank upward. Mud sloughed off in thick slabs. The engine groaned, then growled. The machine lifted itself free of the sinkhole with a shudder, then found firmer soil. The men erupted in cheers so loud they startled a flock of crows into flight. The tank circled back toward them, treads flinging dirt as it rolled across the field with a newfound confidence, as if the machine itself had realized what it was capable of. But the emotional heart of the story didn't lie in the cheers. It lay in the moment when the old farmer who had brought the cedar parts, who had quietly stood at the far edge of the workshop yard, removed his hat, wiped his eyes with a gloved thumb and whispered, "My boy's gonna live. God help me. He just might live." Mercer saw him, and something inside him cracked. This wasn't engineering. It wasn't military innovation. It wasn't even patriotism. It was a father holding onto hope with both hands. The tank approached again, engine roaring in triumph, and for a brief second the noise drowned out the prairie wind. The volunteers rushed to the machine, touching its steel as if greeting a returning friend. Thompson slapped the hull and shouted something lost in the noise. Ellis leaned against the tracks, wiping sweat and frost from his forehead. But Mercer remained still. His gaze drifted across the prairie, the flat, endless ocean of land where he had grown up repairing machinery under blistering summers and bone-cracking winters. The land that taught him stubbornness, the land that killed the weak and hardened the willing, the land that the Germans mocked because they didn't understand it. And he realized that this machine wasn't a miracle. It was inevitable, because the prairie demanded invention. It demanded adaptation. It demanded survival. He turned back to the workshop where Captain Hall had reappeared without warning, jaw slack, watching the tank devour the mud like a predator built from steel in desperation. Hall approached, boots sinking deep into the soil. What did you do?" Mercer didn't smile. He didn't boast. He simply said, "We let the prairie decide how a tank should move." Behind them, the machine idled, plumes of exhaust drifting upward like breath from some ancient beast awakened from a long sleep. And in that moment, Mercer understood that the Germans, with all their precision, all their engineering pride, had overlooked one truth. A machine built from harsh land inherits its spirit, and the prairie had only one spirit: endure, no matter the weight. The tank was still steaming when they hauled it back toward the workshop, frost melting off its hull like sweat from a long-distance runner. The early morning had hardened into a pale, brittle noon, the kind where shadows seemed painted onto the prairie floor in sharp, ink-black strokes. The wind had quieted, but not kindly. It hovered low and cold, the kind of stillness that made even distant fences creak. Inside the workshop, the men moved around the machine with a reverence normally reserved for monuments. No one boasted. No one laughed. Their excitement had cooled into something heavier, deeper, a realization that they had crossed a threshold none of them fully understood yet. The test run hadn't simply succeeded. It had revealed something about the tank and about themselves. Corporal Ellis tightened a bolt near the transmission casing, pausing only to whisper to himself, "We built something Germany didn't plan for." The words weren't triumphant. They were fearful, almost awed, as if he'd glimpsed a truth too large for the workshop walls. Thompson ran a hand over one of the cedar plates, now thick with mud. "It climbed out of that pit like it had a mind of its own," he murmured, "like it refused to die out there." Mercer didn't join the conversations. He stood at a distance staring at the machine with a quiet unease building in his chest. It wasn't the machine's power that unsettled him. It was what that power meant. The Germans had their tigers, their panthers, their engineering pride forged in precision factories. Canadians had this, a hybrid creature built from farm steel, frustration, and hope. A symbol of a nation improvising its way through a war it hadn't asked for. Captain Hall broke the silence with the sound of polished boots on concrete. He approached the group with a stiffness that seemed more fragile now. He wasn't just an officer anymore. He was a witness to something beyond regulations. "I'll be sending a report to Ottawa," he said, eyes never leaving the tank. A positive one, but Mercer didn't look relieved. "A report won't matter if the front doesn't get the machines." Hall hesitated. His voice softened. "If this design holds, command will want prototypes built immediately." Mercer inhaled slowly. He could feel the shift happening, the inevitable moment when invention becomes bureaucracy, when the soul of a creation becomes paperwork, when the men who gave birth to something raw and alive are pushed aside for efficiency. And yet, there was no resentment in him, only the weight of knowing that what started in this prairie workshop might soon carry lives across Europe. The afternoon deepened. The men prepared for a second test, this time on a steeper slope carved by erosion behind the workshop. The ground there was treacherous, soft underneath, deceptive on the surface, the kind of terrain that swallowed heavy machines whole. As the tank rolled out again, the sound of its engine vibrated through the cold air. Metal plates clattered against each other. Steam drifted upward like ghosts rising from the ground. When the operator pushed it toward the slope, Mercer walked beside it again, boots crunching in the stiff earth. His coat whipped behind him. His breath fogged. The tank reached the incline. It paused, and then it climbed. Not fast, not smoothly, but with a steady insistence that felt eerily human. Mud spat from beneath the tracks. The steel groaned. The hybrid engine roared, more animal than machine. Then the impossible happened. The tank reached the top without sinking, without stalling, without sliding backward. When it crested the ridge, the men broke into stunned applause. Thompson let out a ragged shout. Ellis laughed, a laugh that cracked in the middle like it had forgotten how to sound. But Mercer didn't cheer, because what he saw from the top of that ridge wasn't victory. It was distance, endless prairie stretching in every direction, fields that had raised him, hardened him, shaped him, and beyond that, oceans, then countries, then the shattered landscapes of Europe where boys not much older than Thompson waited in cold trenches for machines that wouldn't die in mud. He imagined German officers staring across churned battlefields, seeing a tank like this dragging itself across ground their calculations said was impossible. He imagined the confusion, the disbelief, and he imagined something else too, the realization that for once they had underestimated a quiet country's harshest teacher, the land itself. The tank came to a stop behind him, hissing steam. The operator climbed out, face flushed with cold and triumph. "Sir, this thing isn't just working. It's fighting." Mercer turned to him, eyes reflecting the pale sky. "It's surviving," he corrected gently. "There's a difference." Sunlight slid behind a passing cloud, washing the world in muted gray. The wind picked up again, carrying the raw scent of wet earth and something metallic, not from the tank, but from the sky, as if a storm were gathering somewhere far beyond sight. The men began their descent back toward the workshop, their boots leaving temporary imprints on the frost before the wind erased them. Mercer lingered at the top. He looked down at the machine below, a strange, stubborn beast built from farm steel and wartime fear, a creation that bore the fingerprints of every man in that workshop, a weapon born not from anger, but from necessity and hope. And he felt something shift inside him, not dramatic, not sudden, just a quiet settling of truth. Germany mocked Canadian farm tools because they mistook simplicity for weakness. But on the prairie, simplicity was survival, and survival was the one thing no enemy could out-engineer. Mercer inhaled the cold air, let it burn in his lungs, and whispered to himself, "They'll never see it coming."